In the mid-14th century, a silent, invisible terror descended upon Europe. It moved with relentless speed, leaving behind a landscape of desolation and despair. This was no ordinary affliction. It was a plague of unprecedented scale, a biological cataclysm that would reshape the very fabric of human existence. But what if this profound destruction, this unfathomable loss, harbored a hidden seed? A seed of change so radical, it would steer the course of history in directions no one could have possibly foreseen. What did this ultimate darkness truly unleash? The year is 1346. From the distant plains of Asia, a deadly bacterium began its slow, inexorable march westward. Carried by fleas on rats, it boarded ships, infiltrated cities, and traversed continents. For 5 agonizing years, from 1346 to 1351, it held the continent in its suffocating grip. The statistics, even centuries later, remain chilling. Europe's population, once teeming with life, was about to face a reckoning unlike any other. A demographic abyss opened up, swallowing millions. But what happens when the very foundation of society is so catastrophically undermined? The numbers are almost impossible to grasp. Estimates suggest that between 75 and 200 million people perished globally. In Europe alone, the Black Death claimed the lives of roughly 30 to 50% of its total population. Imagine the silent streets, the abandoned farms, the vast tracts of land lying fallow. Entire villages vanished. Families extinguished. This wasn't merely a health crisis, it was an existential threat. But amid this absolute devastation, within the void left by so many lives, lay an unexpected opportunity. A cruel twist of fate, perhaps, but a powerful one. Before the plague, Europe was a continent defined by rigid social hierarchies. Feudalism reigned supreme. A system where power flowed downwards from kings to nobles, knights, and finally, to the vast majority, the peasants. Their lives were bound to the land, their fates tied to the whims of their lords. Serfdom was their reality, a life of perpetual labor with little hope for advancement. It was a world seemingly immutable, entrenched for centuries. But what could possibly shake such a deeply rooted structure? What force could unravel generations of tradition and power dynamics? For the serf, life was a continuous cycle of toil. Plowing, sowing, harvesting. Their days were dictated by the seasons and the demands of their lord. They had no true freedom, unable to leave the land without permission, often marrying only with their lord's consent. Their labor sustained the entire society, yet they received the smallest share of its bounty. This was the established order. A system based on land and loyalty, where change moved at a glacial pace. But what happens when the very foundation of this labor, the endless supply of hands, suddenly vanishes? As the plague swept through villages and towns, it did not discriminate. Lords and ladies fell, but the death toll among the peasantry was catastrophic. Their close living conditions, their constant interaction, made them especially vulnerable. And as they died in staggering numbers, something utterly unprecedented began to emerge. A profound shortage. Not of food, not of land, but of human hands. The sheer volume of death created an immense, insatiable demand for labor. What could this newfound scarcity mean for those who remained? For the survivors? Suddenly, the tables were turned. For centuries, laborers had been a disposable commodity, easily replaced. Now, they were a precious, dwindling resource. Lords, whose vast estates lay fallow, crops rotting in the fields, faced a terrifying prospect: ruin. Who would plant? Who would harvest? Who would tend the livestock? The surviving peasants, fewer in number but now indispensable, found themselves with an unimaginable power. Leverage. A word that, for generations, had held no meaning in their lives. But what would they do with this newfound, accidental advantage? With fields overgrown and estates threatened, landowners had little choice. To keep their lands productive, they had to compete for the few laborers available. This competition translated into demands from the peasants. Higher wages, better working conditions, and, most revolutionary of all, freedom from serfdom. The very concept would have been unthinkable just a decade prior. Yet, here it was. The ancient chains of feudalism, once thought unbreakable, began to loosen. How quickly can a crisis undo centuries of ingrained power structures? And what happens when the powerless find their voice? The economic impact was immediate and dramatic. Wages for agricultural laborious and skilled craftsmen soared. In some regions, they doubled, even tripled. This wasn't merely a temporary bump, it was a fundamental revaluation of labor itself. A medieval peasant, once barely subsisting, might now earn enough to purchase small luxuries, or even save for land of their own. It was a complete reversal of economic fortunes. But such a radical shift couldn't happen without friction. The powerful don't easily relinquish their control, do they? The most profound social consequence was the accelerated decline of serfdom. Landlords, desperate for workers, often offered freedom as an incentive. Peasants, no longer bound to the land, could move, seek better opportunities, and choose their employers. This mobility was revolutionary. It chipped away at the very bedrock of the feudal system, replacing fixed loyalties with economic choice. The rigid, inherited status that had defined generations began to fragment. What would society look like when individuals had the power to redefine their own fate, rather than being born into it? The plague didn't just kill people, it killed an economic and social system. The traditional hierarchy, so dependent on a large, subjugated workforce, could not sustain itself. Landowners tried to resist. They passed laws attempting to fix wages and prevent peasant mobility, but these efforts largely failed. The market forces, driven by the scarcity of labor, were too powerful. The king's decrees, the lord's threats, they simply couldn't conjure workers out of thin air. The absolute power of the feudal lords was irrevocably diminished. A new era was dawning, one built on a very different set of principles. The newfound leverage and rising expectations didn't always lead to peaceful negotiation. When lords tried to reassert control or levy new taxes to compensate for their losses, the empowered peasantry often responded with defiance, and sometimes, with violence. A series of peasant revolts erupted across Europe in the decades following the Black Death. These weren't mere riots, they were organized challenges to authority, fueled by a collective realization of their own indispensable value. What happens when the lowest rung of society decides it's had enough, and knows it has the power to demand change? One of the most famous examples was the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and John Ball, thousands of peasants marched on London, demanding an end to serfdom and oppressive taxes. Though ultimately suppressed, the revolt sent a shockwave through the English elite. It demonstrated the fragile nature of their power and the growing agency of the common people. This wasn't just a local disturbance, it was a symptom of a continent-wide transformation. A clear sign that the old order was irreversibly fractured. The genie was out of the bottle. Beyond economics and social structure, the plague deeply impacted the psychological and philosophical landscape of Europe. The Church, once an unassailable moral authority, saw its credibility shaken. Why did God allow such suffering? Why were the prayers of priests and bishops seemingly powerless to stop the death? The inability of the Church to offer explanations or protection led to widespread doubt and skepticism. People began to look for answers beyond divine will. This fracturing of unquestioning faith would have profound, long-term implications. For what takes root when old beliefs begin to wither? As the land-based feudal economy weakened, a new class began to assert its power, the merchants. With fewer people, trade routes needed to be re-established, new markets explored, and goods moved across a changed continent. The plague, in its grim efficiency, had cleared away many of the old guard, creating opportunities for those with entrepreneurial spirit. Wealth shifted from inherited land to accumulated capital, empowering those who dealt in commerce and innovation. This new moneyed class had little interest in the old feudal loyalties. Their power lay in urban centers, in bustling ports, in the flow of goods and ideas. Urban centers, despite their devastating losses during the plague, became crucibles of this transformation. Cities offered opportunities for social mobility that the countryside could not. A peasant who fled serfdom and survived in a city for a year and a day could often gain their freedom. These urban environments, fueled by trade and burgeoning industries, became magnets for the newly mobile population. They were places where wealth could be created, not just inherited, and where new ideas could flourish, away from the conservative grip of the feudal lord. What new forms of human interaction and thought would emerge in these dynamic hubs? The Black Death fundamentally accelerated the transition from a land-based feudal economy to a money-based market economy. Lords, unable to rely on forced labor, increasingly leased out their land for rent, creating a class of tenant farmers. Money, not inherited status or bound labor, became the primary measure of wealth and power. This shift created greater economic freedom and paved the way for more sophisticated financial systems. It wasn't just a change in currency, it was a change in the very engine of society. What happens when the foundations of wealth itself are fundamentally redefined? For centuries, European society had been a rigid pyramid, with virtually no movement between its layers. The plague, however, created gaps and openings. Surviving peasants could climb the social ladder, acquiring land, becoming master craftsmen, or joining the burgeoning merchant class. Sons of serfs could, for the first time, imagine a life beyond their father's toil. This increased social mobility, while still limited by modern standards, was revolutionary for its time. The idea that individual merit or fortune, not just birthright, could elevate one's station began to take root. A whisper of possibility. With fewer hands available, there was an urgent need to increase productivity. This scarcity spurred innovation and the adoption of new technologies. Simple agricultural tools were improved, labor-saving devices became more widespread, and new methods of farming were explored. The incentive was clear: do more with less. This pragmatic drive for efficiency, born from sheer necessity, laid groundwork for future technological advancements. What other hidden benefits can arise from the most desperate of circumstances? The trauma of the plague, coupled with the weakening of traditional authorities, fostered a shift in intellectual thought. The focus began to move away from purely theological explanations and towards a greater emphasis on humanity itself. This wasn't an immediate, conscious break, but a subtle, evolving change in perspective. Scholars, artists, and thinkers began to explore the human experience, individual potential, and the wonders of the natural world with renewed vigor. What kind of questions do people ask when their old answers fail them completely? This emerging worldview, later to be termed humanism, placed human beings at the center of inquiry, celebrating their achievements and capabilities. It emphasized reason, classical learning, and a more secular understanding of the world. While the plague itself didn't directly cause humanism, it undeniably created fertile ground for its growth. It was a catalyst, accelerating the decline of old dogmas and opening minds to new possibilities. The soil was prepared, though the full bloom would take time. What happens when the collective human spirit begins to reclaim its own narrative? The severe loss of life meant that each surviving individual became, in a very real sense, more valuable. Their skills, their labor, their very presence, held greater weight. This increased individual worth began to permeate society, chipping away at the collectivist nature of medieval feudalism. It laid the psychological groundwork for later ideas of individual rights and freedoms. When life itself is so precious, do our perceptions of personal liberty and agency also change? A subtle but profound shift in the human spirit was underway, born from tragedy. Art, ever a mirror to society, reflected these profound changes. While early post-plague art often depicted themes of death and morbidity, a new vibrancy soon emerged. Wealthier merchants and empowered individuals could now commission art, shifting patronage away from solely the church and nobility. This diversification of patrons allowed for new subjects, new styles, and a greater emphasis on realism and human emotion. The stage was being set for an explosion of creativity. What happens when the canvas of human expression is suddenly freed from centuries of constraint? So, how does a plague that wiped out half a continent accidentally contribute to a period of unparalleled cultural and artistic flourishing? The connection is indirect, yet undeniable. The weakening of feudalism, the rise of a wealthy merchant class, increased social mobility, and the questioning of traditional authority all created the conditions necessary for the Renaissance to bloom. The seeds were sown in the very soil that had once absorbed so much death. The Black Death didn't cause the Renaissance, but it cleared the way. It removed obstacles. It shifted the tectonic plates of society. What an unexpected legacy for such a horror. Consider the profound irony. An event of unimaginable suffering and loss became an accidental catalyst for societal restructuring. The very system that had defined Europe for centuries, feudalism, began to unravel not from external invasion or internal revolution, but from a microbial enemy. The death toll was a horrific price, but its consequence was a more fluid, dynamic, and eventually, a more individual-centric society. The path to modernity, however winding and brutal, was undeniably altered by this microscopic killer. How many other historical turning points were, in fact, born of such grim paradoxes? The Black Death stands as a stark reminder of history's unpredictable currents. A catastrophic tragedy, yes, but also an accidental architect of profound change. From the ashes of devastation rose a new socio-economic landscape, one where the common person held greater value, where wealth was redefined, and where the seeds of intellectual and artistic rebirth were sown. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and the strange, often brutal, ways that progress can emerge. What lessons does this paradox hold for our understanding of crises today?